Welcome to session 2.2 of Exploring Managerial Practice. In this session we are going to think about getting to an organisation and the various aspects to this. It is important to understand an organisation if you're going to understand management, as the organisation is a context where we find managers. With this in mind, the learning objectives of this session are firstly to identify the characteristics of an organisation and the impact these characteristics have on the organisation. We are also going to consider the organisational context, as in the external environment, so we can get a full understanding of the various factors and pressures which influence how organisations operate. This is also important for your assessment. On Moodle you will find some resources which might help you in working through this session. So why is it important to assess an organisation when we are studying management? In 1965, Breck suggested that the organisation is the framework of the management process. And this framework can firstly define the responsibilities of management at various levels. In other words, what is required of a manager. Think about management in different organisations. Do they have the same responsibilities? A small business with one manager may have a wide remit and a range of responsibilities, whereas a departmental manager in a large organisation may have quite a narrow span of control and influence. Secondly, it determines how responsibilities could be delegated. Depending on the organisational structure, the management may have a number of employees who they can delegate some responsibilities to. Going back to the small versus large business example, the manager of a small business may have the total employee body available to them, whereas the departmental manager in a large organisation will have a particular group of employees they can ask to do tasks. Thirdly, the organisation as a framework coordinates the execution of responsibilities. This is about how managers work together and collaborate across the organisation to deliver objectives. And the last way in which the organisation acts as a framework is by maintaining morale. This is about how management can motivate their employees and keep them engaged. Their ability to do this will either be helped or hindered by the way the organisation operates. Now, Breck can be considered a classical management theorist, like those discussed in session 1.2, where control of the workforce was an important aspect of management. Although Breck did have some human relations movement leanings, as can be seen by the inclusion of morale. However, understandings of management are evolving. Cole suggested that management was once the controlling factor within an organisation. However, now it is considered the function of the organisation. What this means is managers are now expected to set and achieve objectives through navigating the complex and at times conflicting pressures experienced by the organisation. So now we know that the organisation is a framework. Therefore, if we are to really understand management and the issues they face, we need to understand the organisation and the context in which it operates. This can help us understand the different influences and pressures faced by organisations and ultimately managers, where they come from and how they might manifest. These can either be internal or external influences, although some of the pressures faced by organisations might be unique to that organisation. We can recognise some are recurring and experienced by many organisations. We are first going to consider the internal organisational variables and the 5 notable variables that contribute to constructing that framework known as the organisation. These are strategic intention, structure, ownership, size and culture. So let's begin with strategic intention. Strategy is about how major resources are organised to enhance the performance of an organisation, and this is generally a responsibility of senior management who will try to increase performance so they can achieve organisational goals or purpose. However, managers can't achieve this alone. They need the people in the organisation to try to achieve this too. But for people to pursue this, they need to know what the organisation is trying to do. That means managers need to communicate it. They communicate this through developing mission statements, visions, goals and objectives. These are grouped together as strategic intentions. Miller and Dess suggest that these form part of a hierarchy. At the top is vision, which is the future orientation of the organisation. Next is a mission. This is a statement of key values. Then there are goals, which are specific intentions, but they're also somewhat general. The final level of the hierarchy is objectives. Objectives, like in session 2.1, are the activation of the goal, how they are going to do it. Depending on their position within the organisation, management may have to develop and communicate these strategic intentions to employees. It is important to highlight, irrespective of their position within the organisation, all managers will work to achieve them. They should use these strategic intentions to guide them. The next internal variable that can influence an organisation is its structure. Needle suggests that an organisational structure is a grouping of activities to achieve organisational goals. So what does that include? The organisational work around roles, the grouping of roles to establish teams, the allocation of power and authority, and coordination, control and information systems. This makes it seem like a planned activity, but that's not always the case. The structure may organically emerge as the organisation grows, or it can be developed through a series of choices such as hierarchy, specialisation or internationalisation. Kaplan identifies 5 types of organisational structure. So firstly, the simple structure. This is associated with a small business where the managing director is also the owner and they are readily available to the employees. Then we have the functional structure. This is a traditional organisational structure which is suitable for organisations which have outgrown the simple structure. These have specialist functions, for example, HR or marketing. There is increasing distance between the managing director and the employees. Instead, the main employee contact is with departmental heads. As organisations outgrow the functional structure, they might move to a divisional structure. The divisional or multi-divisional structure is appropriate when organisations diversify and outgrow the functional structure. This structure begins to see a separation of the corporate headquarters at the top of the company and the operations of the organisation. Instead of department heads reporting to a managing director, there is now strategic business units which operate as distinct entities. An alternative to the divisional structure is a holding company. This is similar to the divisional structure, however the arrangement is looser. It generally comes about through acquisition. This could be a number of independent companies controlled by a coordinating group. This replaces the corporate headquarters and the strategic business units. The final structure discussed by Kaplan is the matrix structure. This is a different approach to the traditional hierarchy where organisational relationships are set up as a grid. Employees may have multiple lines of reporting across the organisation. It is a networking approach where divisions can benefit from shared resources. The next internal variable we're going to think about is ownership, which can also influence the organisation and how managers work. There can be links between ownership and the organisational structure in the setting of goals, which we have just discussed. Generally speaking, there are 3 types of ownership. Firstly, the sole trader. This is a business owned and administered by one person. Basically, they have all the responsibility. The owner is the managing director. Another type of ownership is partnerships. This is when 2 or more individuals establish an organisation together. The split in ownership is based on the level of initial investment. That means there may not be equality in the partnership in terms of control and influence. In larger partnerships, they tend to appoint a managing partner and decision making is conducted through voting, which includes all partners. Finally, there are limited companies. A limited company is a separate legal entity. These tend to be larger organisations where ownership is separated. This means all of the assets and the liabilities are owned by the business, not the shareholders who own them. There are 2 different types of limited company. They can either be public limited or private limited companies, and the difference is inferred by the name. Public limited companies are basically public. Shares are available for the general public to purchase. They are listed on the stock exchange. Whereas the private limited company does not make its shares publicly available. These are generally family businesses or owned by current management. Think for a minute, are there any potential issues with a separation of management and ownership? You might want to pause and note down your thoughts as they might be relevant in further sessions. The next variable we need to consider is the size of an organisation. Organisations are categorised according to their size, but this can be a difficult measurement. In 2003, the EU developed a definition of small and medium-sized businesses in order to ensure there was a shared understanding across the common market as to what a small and medium-sized business is. They base their definition on the number of employees, turnover and balance sheet totals. To be considered a small or medium-sized business, you would have to have less than 250 employees, an annual turnover not exceeding €50 million and an annual balance sheet not exceeding €43 million. But there are other opinions on what makes a business small that don't just focus on the numbers. The Bolton Committee in 1971 thought there should be a consideration of ownership, independence and small market share when defining small business. The final internal variable we are going to think about is culture. Organisational culture is a highly researched field, but there is little agreement on the definition. It's a concept that we think we understand, but it's difficult to articulate. Dylan Kennedy suggested that culture is the way we do things around here. It has also been suggested to be a pattern of assumptions, a pattern of behaviours, and a shared understanding. There are lots of different definitions and models available when thinking about culture. One of these is Handy. He suggested there are 4 types of organisational culture. The first is a power culture. This is where a central figure holds the power which influences policy and people's activities. It is very focused on an individual. The next is role culture. This is a formal policy-driven culture. There are clear job descriptions which influence people's activities. Then we have task culture. This is where activity is focused on achieving a task. This is team focused where resources and people are brought together and valued for their contribution. And lastly, person culture. The individual is at the centre and the structure supports them. This culture is influenced by individuals within the organisation. So let's pause for a minute and think about how these variables create managerial issues and if you recognise any issues arising from these variables in your organisation. In addition to the internal environment, we also need to consider the external environment. Organisations do not exist in a vacuum. They are open systems which are influenced by outside forces. This can include the local market where they are situated. For example, can they access labour locally? It can also be the national context, which is varied and complex. An example of this might be increases in minimum wage. And it can also include the industry context, so the particulars of the industry which the business operates. For example, what do your competitors pay? The PEST-L analysis is a common way of scanning an organisation's environment. It is a useful method of understanding all the influences that impact on the organisation, and it's a good starting point for understanding the complexities and pressures faced by an organisation. Remember, the organisation is a framework for management, so it is important for managers to recognise and understand the impact of these external variables. An example might be economic impacts. This can include the state of the economy. If it is in a recession, the size of the organisation may shrink to meet financial pressures. Pause for a moment and think how that could create managerial issues. It is important to note these factors may not have an equal influence on the organisation. One may be more prominent than another at various times. Also, some issues identified may be categorised as multiple factors. At industry level, it is important to understand your competitive environment. This can be important for managers when they're developing strategy, as they need to think about what their competitors are doing. Porter's 5 forces is a prominent model which can be used to assess the environment. The 5 forces are, firstly, threat of new entrants. Can new businesses easily enter the market? Are there any barriers to entry? Next, we have threat of substitutes. Can your product or service be easily substituted for something else? Then there is rivalry amongst competitors. Are there similar businesses and high levels of competition? How intense is the rivalry? The next force is the bargaining power of suppliers. Can your suppliers increase prices? Are there alternative suppliers? And finally, the bargaining power of buyers. Can those who buy your product or service switch suppliers? Are there limited cost barriers? So hopefully you now have a fair idea of the range of factors impacting on an organisation. Remember, it is important to understand this because management is a function which sets and achieves organisational goals, and it is the organisation that provides a framework for management. This suggests an inextricable link between management and organisations. To understand what managers do, we need to understand their context and the influencing factors. These are both internal and external. They are also not likely to be fixed. It could be changes in these variables that create the issues for management. However, having a good understanding of the organisation as a framework allows for managerial issues to be understood and addressed, which is what is asked of you in your assessment.